All right, folks, we are a few minutes into our hour together, so I want to get us started to make sure that we are getting the best use of our time. I think we may have a few more join us as we dive in here, but welcome and thank you all so much for being online. I'm Carly Strauss. For the past year, I've been part of the team that leads the Safety Respect Equity Coalition's day-to-day operations. On behalf of the Coalition's leadership, I want to thank you all for making the time to be with us today for this webinar on reporting and response. This webinar is part of a series that the Coalition's running that has focused deeply on various elements of the Coalition standards. I want to extend my thanks to our speaker today, Rahel Bayar, who has committed her time and passion to this work throughout her lifetime, and particularly for this session and a great session that she led at our summit in June. As we're diving in here, just want to cover a few housekeeping items. First of all, we are recording this session, and slides in the recording will be available online next week. We do want to make sure that we have time for your questions, but while you're not speaking, please do mute yourselves to help us minimize background noise. And throughout the presentation, if you've got any questions, you can throw them in the chat box either publicly or directly to me, Carly Strauss, if you'd like to ask them anonymously. And we'll be asking those as we dive into Q&A at the end. We'll also have some time for you to unmute yourselves and share your questions in your own words in the Q&A at the end. Finally, I just want to share a few words on the Coalition's path to this point before I turn it over to Rahel. For those of you who aren't as familiar with our work, the Safety Respect Equity Coalition is a group of over 110 organizations across the country who have come together to reduce gender discrimination and sexual harassment in our Jewish community. These organizations are spread from coast to coast. They vary greatly in size and include national organizations and movements, funders, JCCs, individual congregations, Jewish service agencies, and many others. The Coalition's goal is to bring all of their work together under one banner. We want to serve as a catalyst, a convener, and a clearinghouse. We want to lift up the good work that's already happening and support new solutions in areas where our members are finding challenges. Our goal is threefold: universal leadership commitment, organizational change, and culture shift across the entire Jewish communal world. We're so grateful to have you on this journey with us. And today I'm really excited to introduce Rahel, who will lead us in conversation about reporting and response best practices for sexual misconduct cases. Rahel is a managing director at T&M Protection in their Sexual Misconduct Consulting and Investigations Division, where she consults on policies and procedures creating safe spaces, conducts investigations into historical abuse allegations, sexual harassment and boundary violations, and conducts trainings across the country for schools, camps, synagogues, churches, media companies, financial institutions, youth organizations, and nonprofits on sexual harassment, preventing child abuse, boundaries, consent, and other related topics. She is a former sex crimes and abuse prosecutor from the Bronx DA's office, where for many years she prosecuted hundreds of crimes, including high-profile pattern rape cases involving adults and children. She was a recipient of Jewish Week's 36 Under 36, and is a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Rutgers University and Seton Hall University School of Law. Rahel, thank you so much for being here, and take it away.
Thank you so much, and it is fabulous to be here and to be talking to so many people that I actually cannot see, but so many names that I really do recognize. And so for the course of the next 45 minutes to an hour, what I really want to be able to engage in is a real dialogue about what all of this means. And I think in order to really do that, the first thing that really needs to be done is really take a step back and ask the question of, when you're dealing with sexual harassment in the workplace, when you're dealing with the responses, when you're dealing with your complaint procedure, when you're dealing with your investigation, first and foremost, can you take a step back and ask the question, what does dealing with sexual harassment in the workplace actually require? And not just what does it legally require, because in different states it's going to require different things. What should we all be thinking about in terms of each of the places that we work at, no matter what type of workspace it is? What do we need to be doing in terms of a view from the top? And the first thing is what may seem to be an incredibly basic thing, but the question has to be asked, do we really understand what sexual harassment is? And not just do we understand what needs to be in our policy, but do we understand what sexual harassment is? And in the state that your organization is in, do you understand what sexual harassment is in terms of how it's defined, but also what it means? I mean, typically when I end up giving a training on sexual harassment, I'll pose a question. And I'll ask a question of something that may seem simple to people in terms of, a specific scenario or specific situation. And no matter how many people I have in one group, whether it's 10 people or whether it's 400 people, and I ask the question, is this sexual harassment? Inevitably, there's no consensus. Sometimes you have more yeses, sometimes you have more nos, but typically you end up with a lot of, I actually have no idea, and I don't know if this would be considered sexual harassment. And so taking a step back and understanding what it means to have a view from the top is recognizing, okay, if we're not really sure whether something might be considered sexual harassment or not, if we're not really sure what the definition is, how are we educating ourselves to really understand it better? And even more than that, when we have it down and we kind of understand in a broad sense what sexual harassment means for our workplace in the state that we're living in, do we understand who it may impact? Do we understand what it means to have an investigation procedure? Do we understand what it means to have a trickle down and also a trickle up approach? I mean, people always talk about kind of buying into this top-down approach, that there needs to be an assessment from the top that this is a value, that this is important, that this is a priority, right? And that this is something that not only do we say we value, but we're not just giving lip service to it, we actually value it. And so buying into that top-down approach not only means that from the top of your organization, people believe in making change, impacting change, and committing to ensuring that sexual harassment doesn't happen in your workspace. But it also means that you have to have your ears open in terms of what's being said, not just from the top down, but also from the bottom up. What are people saying? What's the feeling around the office in terms of how investigations are done, or what happens if you make a complaint? What's the conversation around the office in terms of how seriously everybody actually takes these sexual harassment, whether it's policies, training, procedure? Are people making fun of it? Are people joking about it? Does it make people so uncomfortable that they don't actually know how to communicate effectively? Are there any check-ins that are happening within that workspace? And then the question really becomes, what's your roadmap? And for every organization, no matter how long you've committed to ensuring that sexual harassment will not happen in your workplace, the question always has to be asked, what is your roadmap? And I look at a roadmap in terms of dealing with the response for sexual harassment, that you really need things to happen in advance. You need to make sure that you have really good policies and procedures. You need to make sure that you have really good reporting mechanisms. And you also really need to make sure that you're training every single person on this, not just your executive team, not just your board, but you're also training the people that are coming in, even if they're just summer interns, even if they're people that are coming in to volunteer their time and maybe they're not getting paid, but they're in the office regularly. And so when you think about building your roadmap in terms of making sure that you have an impactful response and a good investigative procedure, there are things that actually need to come before that. And I have a lot of conversations with people, and there are always a lot of questions about things like policy work and training and what it means to really invest in this. And one of the things that I always say is that you have to be able to invest. It is not easy to change a dynamic or to make sure that you're up to par with best practices unless you're willing to invest everything from your own time and your own financial resources, but also the words and the lip service that you actually pay to this. Trainings can be expensive. Committing to making sure you have the best policies can be expensive. It can be expensive to contact your attorney and say, can you do another review of these policies? And we want to make sure we really understand this. Can you explain this to us? Can you make sure that if I had to have a conversation with someone about our procedure, about how we conduct our investigations, about what we do when somebody comes forward and says, hey, there's something that's making me a little bit uncomfortable, even though I don't want to categorize it as sexual harassment? Are we taking the extra time to invest, even if it requires financial resources, in making sure that every step of the way, the roadmap that we set, we're actually investing in? Because the truth is, you could have the best policies in the world, you could have the best procedures in the world, but if they're going to sit on a shelf and they're not going to be usable and they're not going to be something that you can really utilize and communicate about, then really at the end of the day, it's just a check of the box. And so step one, as I look at it, after you've built this roadmap, or at least understood what roadmap you might actually need, is evaluating what it is that you actually have and what it is you actually need. So for example, taking a look at your policies in general, your anti-harassment policy or your sexual harassment policy. What type of place are you? Are you an organization? Are you a school? Are you a camp? Are you a synagogue? Who are you? And who are the people that are coming in and out of your doors on a daily basis? If you're a camp, then you're dealing with kids. If you're a school, you're dealing with kids. If you're a synagogue, you're also dealing with kids being on the premises. If you're a workspace where you have nothing to do with kids and you're not dealing with educating children at all, then you're essentially an adult-only workspace, unless you have an intern program. And how do you define whether you're an adult-only workspace or not? So in terms of evaluating what you have and what you actually need, I do think you need to take a step back to be able to look at your policies and say, what kind of policies do I have? Do I have a really good sexual harassment policy? And does it not only define and give examples of what sexual harassment is, but does it also give information on that complaint procedure and on that investigative process? Do I also need some sort of code of conduct in terms of dealing with the workplace environment and behavior? Are there certain things that, without a shadow of a doubt, we want people to know are absolutely not okay? Are there certain things in our past that have informed the policies that we're creating now? Do we know that we've had an issue with donors in the past, with sexual harassment in terms of our employees? Do we want to create some sort of code of conduct that lets every single person that comes into contact with our organization, with the place that we work at, understand that this is not something that we are going to accept or put up with, no matter who it is that's doing this? And if you're a child-facing organization or you're an organization that deals with kids, no matter what capacity, you not only need to think about your sexual harassment policy and therefore your complaint and investigative procedure, but you also need to make sure that you have your boundary guidelines in place in terms of how adults interact with kids and vice versa, and also really have an understanding of the abuse requirements and necessities based on where you are. Now, looking at your sexual harassment policy, I can't tell you the number of times I have conversations with people where I say to them, tell me what it says. And their response is, well, I can read it to you, but I don't actually understand what it means. So first of all, have you really read it? Not just have you read it on a page and had somebody actually sign a document that says, you know, I've read the sexual harassment policies, I get it, I'm gonna do the training, all is gonna be okay. Have you really read it? Is it clear to you where there's an issue with trying to understand whether something is, let's say, unwelcome or unwanted? Is it clear to you how you define, you know, a hostile work environment or a quid pro quo? Do the examples of what sexual harassment is actually make sense to you? Could you have a conversation over coffee with a friend or a colleague or somebody who's both about your sexual harassment policy and really be able to understand it? Could you communicate about it effectively? Does it actually make sense to you? Or are you lost in all of the legalese? And therefore, when you try to have a conversation about it, on some level, you're not going to be able to connect as to what it is actually saying the standard is in your workplace or in your state, because the truth is, it doesn't really make sense to you. And even if you have the definition on your screen right now, you'd be sitting there going, okay, but what does that mean? And how do I apply that to our complaint procedure? Does your sexual harassment policy include, first of all, anything that the state says it needs to include, the state that you're in? So for example, I'm headquartered in New York, and New York has had a lot of movement over the last year plus with regard to what actually needs to be in a policy? Are you in a state that's kind of silent about it and you're measuring up to best practices or what the federal standard is? Does your policy include not only definitions and examples, but also does it delineate what your complaint procedure is, what your reporting protocol is? Does it talk about the investigation? Does it deal with things that people are always going to have questions about? Things like anonymity or confidentiality, or whether an investigation can happen and actually remain confidential. Does it have information about retaliation, and not just what retaliation is defined as, but also examples of retaliation that may not be totally as extreme as someone getting fired? Does it explain that icing someone out, leaving someone out, making decisions because you're nervous or scared about them potentially filing a sexual harassment complaint against you because you think they're too sensitive? Does it talk about retaliation in the way that every single person walking into that workspace is going to be thinking about it the minute that they walk in to say, something has made me really uncomfortable, I think I was sexually harassed, or they don't define it as sexual harassment, but it fits the words of your policies? Does it talk about bystander intervention and what someone is actually supposed to do if they see something happening? It's one thing to have a paragraph on bystander intervention and say, look, everybody should intervene and everybody should make sure that, if you see something, you have to make sure that you stop it. It's easy to say that, but what about what that actually means? There needs to be some sort of acknowledgement that when you see something bad happening, your adrenaline is pumping and you are worried and nervous and a little bit scared, and you're saying to yourself, whenever I give a training, I always say something like, are you saying to yourself, is this what the redhead was talking about? Was she talking about this moment? Is this the moment that I'm supposed to be saying to myself, oh, I'm meant to intervene? And on some level, does it give any of your employees an option of a way to intervene without calling someone out and saying, hey, stop sexually harassing someone? Have you given permission to your employees to do something like just create a distraction? Hey, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but you're needed over there for a moment. Can I just borrow you for a second? And that moment where you give your employees a tool of what bystander intervention means, what it means to actually stop something, that can be very powerful. And do you give information in your policy about what the potential outcomes could be? There are a lot of people who walk into a situation where they report sexual harassment to HR and they say, my assumption is that someone's going to be fired because of this. And your policy needs to be able to say there are multiple different outcomes that can come out of a sexual harassment investigation. And if it's found that somebody has sexually harassed, here are all the different potential remedies that could actually exist. So evaluating your policy becomes an incredibly important piece, not just of your roadmap, but of trying to figure out what is missing and what do I actually need to have as a part of this. And then taking a really good look at your reporting protocol and your complaint procedure. There are a lot of policies that say something to the effect of, if somebody comes in and says something, you ask the question, do you want to make a formal complaint? In my opinion, if somebody is coming in and mentioning something or sharing something or saying something, they're making a complaint. And I don't think that turning to someone and saying, do you want to make a formal complaint, is your out. The attitude and the approach should really be, what is your reporting protocol? A complaint is a complaint. So what options are you giving in your policies as to how somebody who may feel really scared or really nervous or very empowered and very specific in the complaint that they want to make, do they have options of who to actually report to? And then is there a mechanism and a procedure that's actually articulated within your policies as to who those point people are, whether there are multiple people, and you always want there to be an option of more than one person for somebody to go to or report to? Because what if the person that's mentioned as the point person is actually the person that's sexually harassing them? You always want them to have an opportunity or an option to go to someone else. Are you clear in your policies and procedures that the complaint process starts with either an option? You can either orally share what's happening or you can write it down. If you orally share what's happening and you give your employees that opportunity, is the person that's then taking the complaint going to turn to them and say, great, now that you shared it with me, I need you to write it all down after you've just gone through this incredibly emotional moment of sharing things that may have been very difficult to share? So what is your organization saying in terms of, does it need to be oral? Does it need to be written? Does it need to be both? Is the person that's that point person. So if you have an HR, it's typically at least one of those point people are typically somebody who's running HR or somebody in HR. Does that HR person have the ability to take notes on what it is that's being shared, as opposed to making that person who's reporting it then write an email or then fill out a complaint form? And what happens when somebody does walk in and they ask you all of these questions, and you have to talk about this investigative process, which again goes back to your policies, because options and giving options of what could happen during that investigative process becomes really important to transparency, but also to understanding that it can't be ad hoc, that it actually needs to be the same procedure no matter what's happening. So do you have a standard in your policy that when somebody comes in and shares something that you're going to have this conversation one-on-one? Does your organization have a policy where you're actually, let's say you have an HR, or let's say you don't have an official HR, where they're actually going to pause and they're going to say, I'm going to bring another colleague in here right now, and it's going to be a 2-on-1 conversation. During the course of this, taking this initial complaint, is somebody assigned to taking notes? Is somebody asking questions? Is it a process of just listening at first and then asking follow-up questions? And you're going to have questions the moment that somebody walks in as to, what does this process entail? What are we doing here? Are you going to talk to all of my friends? Are you going to talk to all of my colleagues? And the truth is, your policy should have and should articulate the fact that you will expect that anybody that's asked to participate in an investigation or a fact finding will cooperate. That's the expectation as in part of being part of this workplace. And so yes, there will be interviews with colleagues. And yes, whoever is doing the investigation, which we'll get to in a moment, is going to be the one who's determining who are all the different people that do need to be spoken to. And the truth is, when you think about creating this complaint procedure and making sure that your policy is very clear, you also want to make it clear that documents will be collected. If there are text messages, if there are emails, if there are, screenshotted Snapchat conversation, if there are Facebook instant messenger conversation, if there's stuff on social media, whatever it might be, people need to understand that when it comes to how people interact in the workplace and a sexual harassment policy, someone may really think that if they email someone or text someone from their personal cell phone or their personal email, it's never going to come into an investigative process. And that's really not the case. And so it's important to understand and to explain to anybody who's walking in there all the different steps of what this complaint process and this investigation is going to entail. And then step 4, as I like to call it, is preparing for kind of the questions and the concerns that are going to come up. I walk in and I say to you, listen, I'm just telling this to you because I care about you and I want you to know that there's someone in your workspace who's not so respectful. And I don't want to call it sexual harassment because that feels like a loaded word, but I just want you to know, I just want someone to know, but I don't actually want to make a complaint. I don't want to make this a formal thing. Well, first of all, how are you dealing with that? And by the way, your policies should not be silent on that. Your policies, again, are going to inform how you answer a lot of these questions. So, for example, depending on the state you're in and depending on the role of the person who's being told, they may not have an option not to bump it up. You know, in New York, if you're someone in a supervisory or management capacity, even if you just hear about something or you have a whiff of something or you hear a rumor about something, the law now requires you to actually bump it up. You don't have the option to turn and say, okay, I totally get it. Let's watch it for a little bit of time and let's see if the behavior ends. And so does your policy explain that there are absolutely times and people where you have to bump it up? You don't have the option to keep it quiet. And does your policy want to actually create a situation where someone might be the holder of this information and not bump it up, whether it's to HR or whoever your complaint procedure is saying is that point person? And so going back to your policies becomes important, because your policies should actually state that no matter whether you see something, no matter whether you're told about something, no matter whether you know about it directly, even if you hear a rumor of something or you have a whiff of something, this needs to be bumped up so a decision can be made as to what to do about it. You know, a lot of times someone will come and say, listen, I'm very hesitant to make this an official complaint. That's not what I intended. I really need 48 hours before you bump this up or you go to HR. You know, I need to think about whether I really want to see this through. So is your policy silent on something like that? Does your policy actually say that any employee must report and must bump up? Or does your policy use language like should report or should report promptly? Because again, all of these questions that are going to be asked could actually be articulated in your policies so that these questions you actually have answers to. You know, and when someone turns to you and says, I don't want anyone else to know about this, I just want it to be handled quietly, or how transparent is this going to be, or who's doing this investigation? Again, these are all questions that can be handled in your actual policy, because the bottom line is, when it comes to something being anonymous in terms of a workplace investigation, it can't be. Because if you made something anonymous in a workplace investigation, you can't actually effectively investigate that. You know, when you turn to someone who is the alleged aggressor or the alleged perpetrator, and you turn to them and you say, I want to talk to you as an investigator about what happened at this time. Tell me about this interaction. How did this happen? You can't do that with anonymity. And that needs to not only be articulated in your policies, but also you need to be able to explain that to the person who's sitting in front of you. And the question of who's doing the investigation is also something that can be handled in your policies, because the truth is that there are many times where you have HR that's actually conducting the investigation. And there are also times where it feels like there's a conflict with HR, because how can you have someone be a neutral third party when you have somebody who may know the players, who may understand the people, and also who may have been involved in something before? And so then it may be necessary to go to outside counsel, or to have outside counsel who's actually advising your workplace say, you need a third-party investigator, whether that's another attorney, whether that's another investigative person that does these workplace investigations. There are a lot of conflicts that can exist with just having a process or a policy of doing them internally. And so there are times when it's totally appropriate to do a fact-finding or an investigation internally with someone that works there. And there are also times when it's necessary to bring in an outside person, whether that's a third party, whether that's an attorney, whoever that may be. And your policy doesn't have to be silent on that. And you know, when it comes to understanding what's going to happen, what kind of responses you want to give, what kind of reactions you want to be prepared for, someone is going to walk in, and in the worst moment of your day, when you are so incredibly busy with 3,000 things that you need to do, literally, you do not have time for anything else. You haven't had lunch. You haven't gone to the bathroom. You are having a bad day. That's when someone's going to walk in and say, can I talk to you about something? Can I share with you something that's happened? And the truth is, people react in very different ways to sexual harassment. People react to harassment in very different ways in general. You can have people that are very conflicted about reporting something. You can have people who hesitate to believe that it was actually sexual harassment. You can have someone who's going to walk in and not want to say the words sexual harassment because they feel it's so loaded. You can also have someone walk in, burst into tears, no matter who they are, no matter how they identify. You could also have someone walk in and make a complaint about someone that in a million years you would never expect to have acted in an inappropriate manner in the workplace. And your disbelief can never show. And so there are a lot of reasons why people don't actually want to report things. And so even if your policy has a must report standard, your policy says, even if there's a rumor of something, even if it's just a whiff of something, you must report this. The bottom line is you still are dealing with adults who have a lot of opinions and impressions about whether something should or shouldn't be reported. And so understanding that there are a lot of reasons why people might not want to talk to you about this. There are a lot of people who may have been in other work situations where it didn't go well, or there are a lot of people who feel like, well, maybe this is going to really impact me in the work environment. And I know that you have an anti-retaliation policy, but let's be honest. People act a certain way, or I can assume that people will act a certain way if they think that I'm trying to change something or that I'm reporting someone that everybody loves. And so not only is it not easy to walk in and make a complaint, it's also not easy to share details of something, especially if you were intoxicated, especially if you feel on some level any responsibility, which no one should ever feel, because no matter what anybody does, they should never ever feel as though they were responsible for someone else's actions towards them. But it doesn't mean that that isn't a reality of how a lot of people feel. And so whether you're someone that works in HR or whether you don't have HR and you're not an HR person, your immediate response, it really matters. Your eye contact matters. Your body language matters. Looking at someone and letting them share what it is that they're sharing, and you turning to them and being like, that matters. Turning to someone and saying, look, really? Right? If you think about just the way that you're looking at my face right now on the screen, everything from my eyes to the way that I'm smiling or not smiling, to my hands, to my body language. Someone comes in to report something and you're sitting there like, I got a lot of stuff going on. That matters. And so your immediate reaction, your ability to turn off everything else that's happened and actually be able to turn on the I'm here and I'm listening and I'm present, tell me what it is. And knowing your investigative procedure, because the bottom line is you can pull that policy out when someone's sitting there, but you don't really want to be sitting there going, okay, we're going to do an investigation and give me a moment. Okay, step one of the investigation is I am going to take your report. Great. Okay, tell me what happened again. Right? You need to be familiar enough with what your policy is and then investigative procedure that you're in a situation where when someone does come in, you actually know how to say, well, listen, this is how we do an investigation here. This is what's in our policy. You're absolutely welcome to read it, and you should read it. Let me go through it with you. And even if you open up your handbook and go through it with someone, that's great, but you should still be in a position where you don't have to first say, I don't know what that actually means. Now, in terms of your immediate response, when I talked about eye contact and body language and the words that you're using, the words that you use actually really matter. And now I'm talking now as though I'm not giving a training for people in HR, because when you're in HR and you're actually doing the investigation, there are certain things you can say and certain things you can't say, and certain ways that you can act and certain ways that you can't. But let's assume for purposes of this webinar that we're talking about people that do not have a specific HR function. The bottom line is the minute you hear something, you are going to have a lot of different reactions, whether it's disbelief that it happened, whether it's immense concern, whether you yourself have had situations of being harassed previously, and it brings up something in you where you see yourself in this person. And so the first thing that becomes really important is to actually listen and to engage in what I like to call not frustrating active listening. right? Active listening, where you turn to someone and you say, okay, so you said it happened on Monday. Now, what exactly happened in this robotic way? That can be a very frustrating active listening. But you want to get all of that information, and you want to be actively present in the conversation that you're having. So if you're not clear on something, ask for that clarification. Okay, so I know that you said that this happened on Monday night. Are you okay if I ask you some clarifying questions? I want to make sure that I'm clear on certain things, as opposed to my realizing I'm not clear on certain things afterwards. You know, you can explain that you're asking these clarifying questions, not just because you're present, but also because you want to make sure you have that full picture. Don't interrogate the person. You're not a prosecutor in this moment. It is not your job to cross-examine them. It is not your job to poke holes in their story. In that moment, your policy should be informing that the initial complaint is being given, where you are collecting that information. You're not interrogating, and you're not trying to poke holes. Well, you said it happened on Monday at 7, but I see that on your calendar you actually had a meeting at 6:45 on Monday, and you were out of the office. So can you explain that to me? Or I see here that you say that this was an inappropriate text message, but I'm looking at your text back and you responded even though it was 2 in the morning. What made you respond at 2 in the morning? Why would you do that? Right? It's not your job to cross-examine someone in that moment. And the truth is, you also don't want to minimize what it is that's happening. And you also don't want to reassure that everything is going to be okay. You know, you always stay away from the, listen, it could always have been worse. I mean, at least we don't have to walk into a precinct together, right? Like it ended at a good moment. And you want to stay away from that, because you don't know how bad it is for that person. You don't know if what they're sharing initially is just the tip of the iceberg. And you don't want to make promises that you actually can't keep. You know, don't tell them that everything is going to be fine and someone's going to definitely get fired. Is that your policy? Is that what your complaint procedure says? Because the whole purpose of an investigation is to get to a point where you can actually make a determination about A, what should happen, what that outcome should be, but also, how are you going to make your workplace a safer space? They can't initially make promises without actually having all the information and following that procedure. Be patient in the conversation. It can be very frustrating to talk to someone who may be confused, or who may be very hesitant, or who may be very scared, or who may be very, very angry. And their anger may come out in the way that they're talking to you. You know, you didn't stop this from happening. You didn't make this stop. You didn't do anything to prevent this. And you can have a lot of anger. And as somebody that has had chairs thrown at me and, you know, things thrown at me and been screamed at and been lunged at, I can tell you, patience is still really necessary. And it's necessary because the bottom line is, you don't actually know what this person has been through. And you're there to hear them. And you're there to make sure that what it is they're saying, that you can actually figure out a way to resolve it in your workspace. And don't share your personal story. No one wants to walk in and say that this happened to them and hear you say, you know what? The exact same thing happened to me. And it was bad, and it was crazy, and it was stressful, but it all worked out great in the end, because look at where I am right now. And now I can talk to you about this. No one wants to hear that, right? And that's really not an appropriate thing in that moment, because the truth is, it's not about you. It's actually about them. And so your reactions and your responses and the things that you say matter. And one of the recommendations that I can really give is, after this webinar, when you go back and you take a look at your policy, ask the question of, okay, if I get any of these questions, if someone says something like this to me, if somebody walks in to talk to me about this, would my initial reaction be to say one of these things or do one of these things? And if the answer is yes, write out a few options of what else you could say. Practice it. Actually turn to a colleague and say, if you were coming to me with something really just stressful in a work environment, and you really felt as though you were being sexually harassed, would this sit the wrong way with you? And there's nothing wrong with preparing yourself, not just in terms of policies, but also in terms of the conversation. And the truth is, when it comes to understanding how to conduct the investigation and who's going to conduct the investigation and how it's going to work. You know, whatever you decide in terms of your actual policy, however you articulate how that investigative procedure is going to go, don't pick and choose when to apply it. It's okay to have something in your policy that says, you know, everything will be looked at, or there will be a fact finding for everything. You don't always have to use the word investigation unless you're in a state where you have to use the word investigation. But the bottom line is, even, you know, in a setting like a summer camp, where things happen so quickly during the day and you have a lot of different staff members, and, you know, a day in camp is like 8 years someone else, you still have to do a fact finding. And even if that means that that's something that happens efficiently and quickly, you can't pick and choose when to apply your procedure and when not to, because you want there to be consistency. And the truth is, that doesn't mean that every single investigation is going to happen exactly the same way. There aren't always going to be documents. There aren't always going to be text messages. There isn't always going to be something that's on social media. There isn't always going to be a third-party investigator coming in. Sometimes it's going to be someone internal, and that's okay. And it's okay to put in your policies, you know, these are all the options of steps that could happen during an investigation, but they're not necessarily always going to happen during every single investigation. And the other thing is, understand that your policy should dictate kind of a line of possible outcomes. Not everybody is going to be terminated. Not everybody is going to not be terminated. You know, there are plenty of times where I get calls from people and I get to do one-on-one trainings for people who have been found to have sexually harassed someone in a work environment, which is very fun for me and very not fun for the person who's sitting with me at all. But there are a lot of different options of things that can happen that don't necessarily involve someone automatically getting terminated. And it's important for your policy to articulate that. And it's important for somebody, when they walk in to actually make that complaint, before that investigation starts, for them to understand all of the parameters of the investigation. Not only how it's going to work, but also what happens when there's an outcome at the end. What are the possibility of things that could come out of it? And also, how transparent is it going to be? You know, when it comes to creating some sort of report, is there going to be an oral report? Is there going to be a written report on this investigation? Is it actually going to be shared with people? Because most of the time, it's actually not shared. And so the question becomes, how do you want to communicate that outcome to the people that are actually involved in that investigative procedure? Now, I feel like there is a lot more that we could talk about, and I want to make sure that there is time for questions and room for questions. And so, Carly, I'm now going to turn it over to you because I can't see any questions, and I am happy to answer anything that anybody may have a question about.
Great. Well, Rahel, we have quite a few questions that have come in the chat already. So thank you so much, and I will dive in. So the first question that came in is, you had talked so much about making sure that sort of the point person understands the policy and can talk to a colleague or a friend about it. Do you have any recommendations for making sure that the full staff of your organization understands and can communicate about your policies?
Yeah, I think that that all comes down to training. And if you think back to the very beginning when we talked about kind of your roadmap, it's not just looking at your policies, it's also training on your policies. And I think that that goes back to the investment. It goes back to the investment of both time, communication, and also financial resources. Who is training on your policies? Is the person that wrote the policies training on it? Are you bringing in an attorney? Are you bringing in an expert in the field to train on it? What kind of training are you doing? Because any type of sexual harassment training should not only go through best practices and scenarios and options, but should also really do a deep dive into your policies. And if you're doing a training that isn't doing a deep dive into your policies, then are you investing your time and financial resources on doing a secondary training where you are actually doing a deep dive on the policies? And sometimes what that means is taking a scenario and using your policy and actually having a roundtable discussion to break it apart. Okay, in this scenario, what would happen based on the policies that we have? And so, you know, what it comes down to is making sure that, when I had said before, kind of that top down and bottom up approach, every single person in your organization needs to have a really good understanding of those policies, and that happens because of training.
Great, and I just want to throw out there, one of our Safety, Respect, Equity Coalition grantees, the organization Ta'amod, is actually here on this webinar, and they are working on developing a training that is both Jewish and compliant to meet your legal requirements. So if you have any questions about that, Nicole, maybe you can put your contact info in the chat box in case anybody wants to follow up with you about that. Next question. Rahel, you had mentioned that for reporting, you recommend having a number of people that somebody can make a report to. Do you have any additional detail on sort of the number of options that people should be able to report to, gender, what roles those people should be in? Any further guidance on who those people should be?
I think that it really depends on what organization you are, right? There could be somebody on this call who has, an organization that has, 150 employees, and you could have somebody on this call who has 5. And so it really depends on who you are and what you're doing. And so let me use an example of let's say, a synagogue, right? At a synagogue, you could have, 2 or 3 people that you could report to that have different roles, but you want to make sure that the person that you're reporting to isn't actually the clergy at the synagogue, right? Isn't the person who may actually need to not only be interviewed, but also may be a part of this. If you're in a school setting, usually the point person is someone like somebody in HR, the head of school, and maybe some sort of counselor, or somebody that kind of doesn't have an administrative role over someone, but serves as another resource. And the truth is, and people are welcome to disagree with me on this, because I think that this is much more of an opinion. I think that what matters is the training that the person has and their ability to communicate more than anything else. And I think that it's always good to have options. If you have the opportunity to have people of different genders or different identities, then that is great. But I really think about it in terms of who that person is versus anything else.
Great, thank you so much. That's really helpful, Rahel. Next question that has come in, since I know we've got a wide variety of people on our webinars and involved in the Safety, Respect, Equity Coalition. For folks who maybe aren't as high up in their organizational hierarchy, how can people sort of be an advocate and bring this to their organization's leadership?
It's a tough one. It's a really tough one, because not knowing who everybody is and kind of where they are within their organization, I think the most important thing is, first and foremost, do you actually have policies? If you don't have policies and you are in a state that actually requires it, you can actually go to the head of your organization and come at it from the point of view of, hey, I think I'm not a compliance person, but I actually think we might have a compliance issue. I just read this article, or I just saw this on this website, and it looks like we're not doing something that we need to do. Let's say that's not an option for you. I think it's okay to walk into the head of your organization and walk into their office and say, listen, I got to tell you, not only have I been doing some research and some reading on this, but I've been really educating myself on this, and I think that we might have an issue or a challenge with this. So here are some solutions that I'd like to be able to share with you. I think there's a very big difference between walking into the head of your organization and saying, we have a problem and you need to fix it, versus I think that there's a global issue here. I have some recommendations and some ways that I think we might be able to communicate and talk about fixing some of these problems. And it's interesting because I actually have been a part of, whether it's webinars or whether it's conversations, and I'm trying to learn what other people do in their workspaces. And I'm hearing that if we don't do X, Y, and Z, we could really have a serious issue, not just legal, but also, chances are something's going to come forward here. Because in this day and age, with everything that's happened over the course of the past 3 years, there isn't a workplace where someone isn't going to come forward at some point and say, something's happened, or something made me uncomfortable, or someone sexually harassed me. So if you take the approach of going to the leadership of your organization and almost taking, we are in this together. This is not something you have to fix, but we should fix this. This should be a value of ours. Not knowing what organization people are from, and knowing that there are a lot of different personalities and a lot of different, There are a lot of different times when something like that can't work. That's probably my best advice. I'm happy to follow up and answer any questions from any specific people.
Yep, and I also just want to offer up the coalition as a resource as you're having these conversations. We know that this can be a topic that makes organizational leadership nervous. Nobody wants to get sued. Nobody wants to end up in sort of a bad situation for the organization. And so if your leadership is nervous about starting this work and being involved in this, we are happy to speak with them. We'll schedule a call and talk about what this is and what we're hoping for from our members. All right, Rahel. Another question that has come in is sort of about what level of detail should be in written policy handbooks. As you mentioned, a policy handbook can outline sort of a few options of these are some of the things that could happen. So how do you do it in such a way that you're sort of not backing yourself into a corner if you want or need to skip steps?
So one of the things that you could, first of all, it's really important for you to know where your organization is and what laws are actually applicable in terms of what your policy needs to have. And the truth is, I'll give you an example. In New York, there are sample policies that are available by the state on a publicly available website. And so first and foremost, you want to make sure that you are complying with any requirements of the state that you are in or that you're headquartered in and that your legal counsel approves of it. But the second thing that you want to think about is it's okay for you to say, you know, possible investigative steps may include, or investigative steps may include, though they may not be, not every step may happen with every single investigation. And there's obviously a better kind of legalese way of putting that, but in just regular everyday speak, that's okay for you to put in your policies. Possible steps may include, and then you can list, you know, possible 10 steps. And by the way, that doesn't mean that there aren't other steps that may actually happen as well. But I think you're dealing with kind of general things, you know, document collection, interviews, conversations, circling back, being able to have, you know, a conversation with any employees, whether they feel that they're involved or not. But what you shouldn't have is every single fact finding will absolutely 100% involve all document review, a review of text messages that may not exist, and then that backs you into a corner, and that's not relevant. So I would make sure that you have that catch-all at the beginning, and you list like a good, you know, 5 to 10 steps or 4 to 7 steps of things that an investigation may involve. But here's the thing: every investigation or every fact finding, at its basic, is going to involve conversations. Do you want to call them interviews? Do you want to call them conversations? Fine. Every conversation or interview that you have, there's going to have to be someone who's actually taking notes on it. Whether that's you as the investigator, and the truth is, when I'm working as an investigator, I never take my own notes. I always have somebody else present. I think that it's best practice to have another person present to make sure you don't actually miss anything. And the bottom line is you're always going to end up having interviews and conversations. So it's okay for you to say that everything, you know, that every investigation will include conversations or interviews, and then investigations may include a series of some of the following.
All right, thank you. We have a few more, and I know we are coming towards the end of our time together, but we've got one person who asks, sort of, if your organization is starting from ground zero, having no policies in place, what are some resources to get started? And another person in particular had asked about resources or sample policies around children and anti-child abuse policies.
Sure. So I think a good place to kind of initially look, and this is very initial, is, again, whatever your state has. So for example, you know, when it comes to kids, first of all, you want to make sure that you are covering the legal basis. And I know I've said this a lot, but I am aware. And I do think that it is important to understand that there are legal ramifications in terms of what policies you have. So first, take a look, you know, do a little bit of a Google search in terms of what's required in your state. I use New York as an example. They have model sexual harassment policies. They have model trainings. They have them accessible and available. Some may work better for others, but you can kind of see what's actually required. And even if you're not in New York, it may be a good idea to actually take a look at what is required in another state in terms of a policy. When it comes to kids, that's a larger question, because you're dealing with everything from mandated reporter requirements, which differ state by state. You want to have a policy that is usable and workable. And you're also dealing with things like interactions between adults and kids and boundary guidelines. And so, I can say that whenever I'm working with a child-facing institution, there's no one size fits all in terms of, this is the standard, this is what you do no matter where you are, no matter who you are. It's really about understanding what that organization or what that school or camp is, and really being able to craft policies that work and that make sense. And I think that, when it comes to things like mandated reporting, looking on your Children's Services website, the Office of Child and Family Services, for example, in New York, has a really good 2-page document, which is not completely up to date with some of the new changes in mandated reporting, but at least kind of delineates some things. And being able to talk to experts. Again, it goes back to investing your time and also your resources, whoever that expert is to you. There are plenty of experts out there that do this for a living, and I think that it's always worth it to invest both time as well as finances in making sure that you have somebody with specific expertise advising you when it comes to what type of policies you actually need and what you actually want to have.
Great, thank you, Rahel. I think we have time for one last question, and then I do want to make sure that we can wrap up on time today. So our last question is sort of about, can beginning to do this work and putting staff on notice that you have these policies and things like that, can that have a chilling effect on people being willing to report? As you talk more about what documents may be collected in an investigation, does that ever backfire and make people more scared to report?
I can't say no, because I don't know. Because it's always possible. I always like to think that the chilling effect may actually be on the bad behavior that requires the report to begin with. And that really what ends up happening is that there's an ability to take a step back and look at the behavior that's happening and say, oh, hold on a second. Should I really be engaging in this? What happens if this is unwanted or unwelcome? What happens if this text message doesn't land right? So much of understanding sexual harassment is in recognizing that though something can appear gray to one person, it may not appear that way to someone else. And if you're not sure how something you say or do is going to land, you don't do it or say it in a work environment. And so, I like to think about it like this. Absolutely, it could have a chilling effect. It could. It could also have a chilling effect on the actual acts. And so I would say that there is absolutely no disadvantage to taking this seriously and investing in the policies, the time, and the resources, but there is a big disadvantage to not doing that. And the truth is, if you feel as though it may have a chilling effect, talk about it. Say, we are embarking on this, not because we're looking not for people to respond, but because we think that this is of value to us, and we really do need people to be able to come forward, and we really do want to make sure that this is a safe space for everyone, because at its core, and again, looking at this webinar and every other webinar that SRE is facilitating, the core is about creating those safe workspaces. And so understanding that creating a safe workspace may actually mean that on some level, someone may feel as though they're hesitant or they realize that you're taking this seriously, and so now they don't know what to do. Well, that starts a conversation, and a conversation leads to communication, and that communication leads to a better workplace for everybody involved.
All right, that was really a good answer to that. So yes, thank you so much, Rahel.
No
I know we are sort of coming up on the end of our hour together, so I just want to say one more time, if you've got leadership who's interested in this work but nervous, please come talk to us here at the Safety, Respect, Equity Coalition. Nicole has also just asked me to share that if you are in a situation where your organizational leadership they are the problem or are a little bit more reluctant to address some of these issues, please talk to Nicole at Tom Mode. They have resources that they're able to connect you with. Rahel, thank you so much for being here, and for all of you who have joined us, thank you as well, and we hope that you'll join us for the last webinar in our series that's coming up on August 21st, and it will be on education and training, so a deeper dive into what types of education and training are available, including hearing from some peer organizations who have embarked on this journey with their own staff. So thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, Rahel, and have a great rest of your day.